Kususangpola, I am Dikyongmo from Mutithang Higher Secondary School. Bhutan e-learning program welcomes you to this lesson. This is economics lesson for key stages 4 and 5. In this lesson, we are going to discuss about elasticity of supply. In your previous lesson, you looked at law of demand, elasticity of demand, law of supply, and in continuation to what you have studied in your previous lesson, we are going to discuss about elasticity of supply. So now, before we begin with our lesson, let's look at the objectives. At the end of the lesson, you should be able to, number 1, give the meaning of price elasticity of supply. Number 2, identify different categories of elasticity of supply. Number 3, represent each category with the help of a graph. The last objective, give the examples of each elasticity. With this, we are going to discuss the lesson. Now, before we go into discussing the lesson, let's look at the key terms that we will be using throughout the lesson. It's very important that you need to understand the key terms which is associated with the lesson. So first, let's look at elastic. What's meant by elastic? I'm sure you have already understood the concept while discussing about the elasticity of demand. So nevertheless, we are going to look at again what's meant by elasticity. So elastic is sensitive to change in price. As the price changes, if the quantity supplied changes, then we call it as elastic. Inelastic is when there is no change in the quantity with a change in price. So this is called as inelastic. So we are going to look at is supply, the meaning of supply. As you have already discussed in your previous lesson about the meaning of supply, so we are going to look at the same meaning which we have discussed in our earlier lesson. So supply is the amount of product that producers are willing and able to sell at a given price, all factors remaining constant. This is called as supply. As we know that time period is very important concept in supply, especially in relation to the study of supply. So we are going to look at the 3 time period. The first time period is the market period. So market period is a period where the supply is completely fixed. You cannot increase or decrease the supply of the commodity. So meaning that there is no change in the supply. Supply is completely inelastic. In the short period, supply can be adjusted to some extent, meaning that the supply of a commodity can be increased within a short period of time. That's a little longer than the market period. The last one we're going to look at is the long run. So in the long run, there's a large change in the quantity supplied, because what happens is in the long run, the firms, they are able to change their scale of production. They can move into a larger scale of production. So therefore, in the long run, the supply becomes more. That's the quantity of supply can be changed into a larger extent. Okay, I hope you have understood the key terms that we discussed here. Okay, now we are going to look at the price elasticity of supply. What is price elasticity of supply? In your previous lesson, we looked at the price elasticity of demand. So now we are going to look at the price elasticity of supply. Before we go into defining what's meant by price elasticity of supply, let's look at some of the components of price elasticity of supply. As we discussed in the law of supply, if there is increase in the price, what will happen to the quantity supplied? Okay, you're right. The quantity supplied will increase because as a producer, you will be willing to sell more goods at a higher price. What will happen to the quantity supplied if the price decreases? Yes, you're right. If the price decreases, the quantity supplied will also decrease. This is because as a producer, as a firm, since you are motivated by the profit, you will be willing to sell more at a higher price and lesser at a lower price. So we now know that there is a positive relationship between price and the quantity supplied. So when we discuss about the elasticity of supply, it's important that you need to know the relationship between the price and quantity supplied. Therefore, law of supply, the concept of law of supply is very important in relation to elasticity of supply. So next concept or the components of elasticity of supply is price elasticity of supply gives the information with regard to magnitude of change in supply in response to change in price. When we were discussing about the law of supply, we did not look at the magnitude change in the quantity supplied because of the change in the price. In this elasticity, we are going to look at by how much the supply is changing with the change in the price. So therefore, elasticity can be measured. The next component is price elasticity is always in positive. This is because when the price increases, the supply increases. When the price decreases, the supply decreases. Therefore, you will see that elasticity of supply is always in positive number. Then the next component is it is independent of the unit of measurement such as nultrum, kilogram, or any other unit because it's expressed in terms of percentage. With all these components we have looked at, now let's define what is meant by elasticity of supply. Can you tell me what is meant by elasticity of supply? Okay. Elasticity of supply is the degree of responsiveness of quantity supplied of a commodity in response to change in its price. Did you get me? Okay, let's repeat. If you have to define elasticity of supply, it is the degree of responsiveness of the quantity supplied of a commodity in response to change in its price. So elasticity tells us by how much the quantity changes with the change in the price. I hope you are clear about the elasticity of supply. Normally, elasticity of supply is expressed in terms of ratio or percentage. So therefore, in order to calculate elasticity of supply, we use the ratio of percentage change in the quantity supplied to the percentage change in price. I'll not be going into detail about this formula because we have a different lesson on this where we will be looking at the two methods of the calculation of elasticity of supply. So now with the concept of elasticity of supply, now we are going to discuss about the categories of elasticity of supply. That's the different categories of elasticity of supply. So there are basically 5 categories of elasticity of supply. So we are going to look at each category with the help of the graph. Let's look at the perfectly elasticity of supply with the help of a graph. So now let's label the graph. This is y-axis, this is x-axis, and I have O here, that's the point of origin. Okay, this graph indicates that the supply is perfectly elastic. So you'll see that the supply curve, it runs parallel to x-axis. The suppliers are willing to supply a larger quantity of commodity at price OP. And in case if the price decreases slightly below OP, then the supplier will not be willing to supply any commodity. At this OP, the supplier will be willing to supply a larger quantity of commodity in the market. So therefore, this supply is called as perfectly elastic supply. The value for the perfectly elastic supply is infinity, meaning that at this given price, the suppliers are willing to supply infinity of commodities in the market. So therefore, we have elasticity of supply equal to infinity. So now with this graph, let's look at the definition of perfectly elastic supply. So when the sellers are prepared to sell an infinitely large quantity of commodity at a particular price and nothing at a slightly lower price is called as perfectly elastic supply. Okay, now let's look at the next category, that's perfectly inelastic supply. Perfectly inelastic supply is opposite to what we have discussed in the first topic, that's perfectly elastic supply. So now we are going to look at with the help of a graph. So we are going to draw the same graph, that's x-axis and y-axis. We have price here, then quantity on the x-axis. So now we are going to look at a situation where the supply is perfectly inelastic, meaning that there is no supply at all, or the supply is 0. If you look at this graph, you'll see that whether the price increases or decreases. Okay, let's say that a situation where the price is P, the quantity supplied is the same. And then let's say now the price is increased from P to P1. Okay, you'll still see that even if there is increase in the price, the supply is completely fixed. So meaning that at any given price, the suppliers, they are not willing to supply any commodity, or the supply is completely inelastic or 0. So therefore, this type of supply is called as perfectly inelastic supply. So you'll see that the supply curve is parallel to y-axis. So therefore, we have the value elasticity of supply equal to 0. So now let's look at the definition. Since we looked at the graph first, perfectly inelastic supply is when the quantity supplied of a commodity does not at all respond to change in its price. So there is no change in the quantity with the change in the price. And then we have already discussed that the value is 0. So you'll know this value when we look at the methods of calculation of elasticity. When you're calculating the value, if you get 0, then we have to consider that that is a perfectly inelastic. And then if you get infinity, then that will be considered as perfectly elastic supply. Let's look at an example of a situation where we will have perfectly elastic and perfectly inelastic. So in the real market situation, you'll see that this kind of categories or this kind of elasticity is very rare. That's a supply where it is perfectly elastic and a supply where it is perfectly inelastic. If you look at an example, for example, like taxes. So we know that taxes are imposed by the government. Sometimes the government will impose tax on the producers, and sometimes the government will impose tax on the consumers or the buyers. So now let's look at a situation where the government imposes tax on the supplier or on the producers. So now what happens is when the taxes is being imposed on the supplier, what will happen is it will have a perfectly inelastic supply. It will have this category of supply. This is because since the tax is being imposed on the supplier, because of the increase in the cost of production, the supplier, they will not be able to produce more quantity of goods and services, although these cases are very rare. So you'll see that the supply curve, that's the S in the picture here, it remains fixed, or you'll not see any changes in the supply irrespective of whether there is change in the price or not. So this is the situation. It runs parallel to y-axis. So this is the case where the government imposes tax on the supplier. So now let's look at the second category where the taxes are being imposed on the consumer. So what happens is when the taxes are imposed on the consumer, since there is increase in the price of goods and services, the supplier, they will be willing to supply more at that price because of the increase in the price. So what will happen is we will have perfectly elastic supply. That's at a slightly higher price, the suppliers will be willing to supply infinitely. So this is a situation where the taxes are being imposed on the buyers. So meaning that the price is going to shoot up. So as soon as the price increases, as a supplier, because your main motive is to earn profit, so you'll be willing to supply more. So this will give us perfectly elastic supply. Okay, now let's look at unitary elastic supply, the third one. Okay, we have y-axis, x-axis, then price on y-axis, quantity supplied on x-axis. So now, this is the point of origin. Okay, this is supply curve. Now we are going to look at a situation where there is equal change in the quantity supplied and price. That is, as the price changes, the quantity supplied will respond to the change in the price in an equal way. Let's consider P, price here, then Q. Now let's consider that the price has increased from P to P1. The quantity supplied will increase from Q to Q1. So now let's look at the change, the magnitude change in the quantity supplied in response to the price. So if you look at this gap, that's the change in the price, that's between the old price and the new price, and then the change in the quantity, that's old quantity and new quantity, you'll see that there is equal magnitude, or the change has occurred in the same manner. So now let's say that if the price has changed by 2%, the quantity supplied would also change by 2%. So this is called as unitary elastic. The value for this elasticity is ES is equal to 1, because it changes in the same manner. Is it clear? Okay, now you look at the definition of unitary elasticity of supply. When the proportionate change in quantity supplied of a commodity is equivalent to proportionate change in its price. Okay, now let's look at elastic supply, the fourth category. So we have y, x here, then price on y-axis, quantity on x-axis. Okay, so now we are going to look at a situation where we have elastic supply. So this is supply curve. So now, okay, now let's say that this is price P, then this is quantity Q. So now let's assume that the price has changed from P to P1. Quantity changes from Q to Q1. So now can you look at the magnitude change in the price with that of change in the quantity supplied? The gap between the P and P1 and then gap between Q and Q1. Can you tell me which one is larger? Yes, this is larger. That's the gap between Q and Q1 is larger than the gap between P and P1. This is, for example, if the price changes by 2%, the quantity supplied to respond by, let's say, 4% or 3%. So you'll see that with the change in the price, the quantity would change by larger quantity. So this is called as elastic supply. So now let's come back to the definition. When the percentage change in the quantity supplied of a commodity is greater than the percentage change in its price. So this is called as elastic supply. So normally you'll see that in the elastic supply and straight line, any straight line supply curve passing through y-axis will occur. So this is the supply curve which passes through y-axis. So this supply curve will have elastic supply throughout. And the value we are going to look at, that's the value of elasticity of supply is greater than 1. Okay, now let's look at the last category of elasticity of supply. That is inelastic supply. So inelastic supply is opposite to elastic supply, what we have looked at right now. So now we are going to look at the fifth one, the last one, that's inelastic supply. We have price on y-axis, quantity on x-axis. Okay, so now if you look at this graph, you'll see that the magnitude change in the price is greater than the change in quantity supplied. So for example, if the price changes by 5%, the quantity would change only by 3%. So this is called as inelastic supply. So the value for inelastic supply is ES is lesser than 1. So it's opposite to what we have seen in the elastic supply. So we have here value lesser than 1. You'll see that the quantity change in the supply is lesser than the change in the price. So now let's look at the definition. So inelastic supply is when the percentage change in the quantity supplied is less than the percentage change in its price. So now if you look at the supply curve for this inelastic, you'll see that any supply curve passing through this x-axis or the x-intercept will have inelastic supply all throughout. No matter whether it stops or whether it goes infinitely, you'll see that throughout this curve, the supply will be inelastic. So the value, as we discussed, is less than 1. So now we are going to look at the example of inelastic and elastic. So we have already discussed that time factor is very important in elasticity of supply. Now let's say that okay, market period, as we discussed, market period is a period where the supply is completely fixed, the supply cannot be changed. And then we looked at the short period where in the short period the supply can be adjusted, and then in the long period the supply can be supplied in a larger quantity. So with this concept, we are going to look at this example. You'll see that price elasticity would be elastic. Suppose, number 1, if the supplier has plenty of spare capacity to increase their output. So this is, if you look at the time duration, you'll see that basically this is to do with the long period. That's in the long period, if the supplier, they have plenty of spare capacity to increase the output, then the elasticity will be elastic. Then in the next picture, you'll see that the supplier, they will be willing to supply. So that's maybe for a short period if they have already a high stock available to be supplied in the market. which is not supplied, but in case if there is increase in the price, they would be willing to supply, meaning that they have already a stock of goods with them. Then the third is short production time frame to get goods produced in the market. Suppose, let's say that the goods which do not require much huge factors of production, for example, like a meal. So if there is increase in that meal, the supplier, they will be willing to, they can supply more quantity in a short period of time. The last one is resources which can be reallocated, which can be substituted to produce any other commodities, can be, in this case, the supply can be elastic. So, for example, like in case of human resources, if that individual person can work in a different firms, then the production of goods and services will be more, or in other words, it can be elastic. Okay, now let's look at an example of the commodities which will remain inelastic in the short run. For example, like if you look at this picture, you'll see that mostly the goods are perishable goods. That's the milk, and then the oranges here, that's the fruit. So normally what happens is, in the short period of time, whether the price increases or decreases, this category of goods will remain inelastic, meaning that there won't be any change in the supply even if there is change in the price, because it has to be supplied within that time frame, since the goods are perishable goods. Okay, you can think about other examples of the goods concerning the time frame, which are elastic in nature, which are inelastic in nature. So as we discussed 5 categories of elasticity, you'll see that in reality, practically elastic and more elastic is more applicable. And then the other one which we discussed about the perfectly elastic and perfectly inelastic are very rare cases. Okay, now if you look at this elasticity supply of new housing. So what do you think about this elasticity in case you have to construct a house? Will it be elastic or inelastic? Let's say there is shortages of house in our locality, and then suddenly there is rise in the price of the houses, and then as a supplier, will you be able to supply the house within a short period of time, or will you require a longer duration of time frame? And then according to this time frame, whether the supply of house will be elastic or inelastic. So you can take an example of this house. So now we know that a lot of things are required to construct house. So for example, like the supply of new housing, that's we need planning permission, that's we need permission from the authority to construct the houses, then plus availability of land to develop the houses, because we know that land is a fixed, land is inelastic in supply, so therefore we also have to consider the land, whether it's available or not. Then plus we will have to consider the shortages of skilled labor, whether the labor is available to construct the houses within a short period of time. We will also have to consider time lags in the production process of new housing development that takes a month to complete or a year to complete. So therefore, you will see that in the short period of time, especially when it comes to housing, the suppliers, they will not be willing to supply. They cannot supply more, not willing. They cannot supply more because of the given time frame, and then a lot of things, a lot of inputs required to construct houses. So therefore, in the short run, it will be inelastic, and then in the long run, it will be elastic. Okay, now, before we conclude the lesson, I have a recap of the lesson. So now, unlike in the past where we looked at the topics, now in this lesson we are going to do some quiz. So you can take note of the answer and then see how much you are scoring. So we are going to recap the lesson with the help of the quiz. And then I have few questions for you all. So now the first question I have here is question number 1. The burden of the tax falls entirely on the sellers if your options are A, the price elasticity of demand is unitary elastic, price elasticity of supply is greater than 1, income elasticity of demand is high, D, the price elasticity of supply is 0, that's perfectly inelastic. Okay, can you give me the answer? What could be the correct answer for this? The correct answer is D, that's the price elasticity of supply is 0, that's perfectly inelastic, because we have already discussed that if the taxes are being imposed on the supplier because of the increase in the cost of production, the supply will remain inelastic. So therefore, the correct answer is D. I hope you have got the correct answer as well. Okay, now look at the second question. The supply curve of antique reproduction is A, relatively elastic, B, relatively inelastic, C, perfectly inelastic, D, unitary elastic. Guess the answer. What could be the correct answer? Okay, let's take an example. Suppose we have old manuscripts or stamps or coin, and if there is increase in the price of those commodities, what will happen to the quantity supplied in the market? Yes, the correct answer is C, that's perfectly inelastic. Perfectly inelastic, so this is the case of perfectly inelastic, where the supply is completely fixed no matter whether the price increases or decreases. So now let's look at the third question. The third question is, if the elasticity of supply is 2, this means that if, number A, the price rise by $1, the quantity supplied will rise by $2. B, the price rises by 1%, the quantity supplied will rise by 2%. C, the price rises by 2%, the quantity supplied will fall by 2%. D, the price rises by 2%, the quantity supplied will rise by 1%. Can you give me the correct answer? You're correct. B is the correct answer. So elasticity of supply is 2, meaning that it is greater than 1. So if the elasticity is greater than 1, meaning that the change in the quantity supplied will be greater than the change in the price. So since elasticity of supply is expressed in terms of percentage or ratio, so we consider this B as a correct answer. The fourth question, which of the following statement is true? A, short-run supply curve is more elastic than the long-run supply curve. B, the long-run supply curve is more elastic than the short-run supply curve. C, short-run and long-run supply curves have same elasticity. D, long-run supply curve is always perfectly elastic. Which one is the correct answer? Okay, as we discussed and as I reminded you again and again, time duration is a very important factor when it comes to elasticity. B is the correct answer. The long-run supply curve is more elastic than the short-run supply curve. So meaning that given the longer time frame, the supply of any commodity can be adjusted, or it can be supplied in a larger quantity. Now the fifth question, if a small percentage, say 1% decrease in the price of chocolate causes a longer percentage, say 3% decrease in the quantity supplied. Number A, demand for chocolate is elastic, demand for chocolate is inelastic, supply of chocolate is elastic, and supply of chocolate is inelastic. So which one is the correct answer? Yes, you're right. C is the correct answer. That's the supply of chocolate is elastic. You know the reason why? Okay, now let's move to the last question. Number 6. Suppose the government adopts a public policy to fight obesity using an excise tax. When considering elasticity, consumers would probably pay more of this tax on fast food than the producers if A, demand is elastic and supply is inelastic, demand is inelastic and supply is elastic, C, they buy more of the product, D, demand and supply are both elastic. Can you tell me which one is the correct answer from here? Yes, you're correct. A is the correct answer. So that is, demand will be elastic and supply will remain inelastic. Because since the tax is imposed on the consumer, so there will be change in the quantity demanded, but for the producers, there wouldn't be change in the quantity supplied. So therefore, A is the correct answer. So now with this, we have come to the end of the lesson, and I hope you have understood what I discussed right now. And then if you look at the question, you'll see that there are a lot of questions which you'll have a lot of insights about this elasticity of supply. You can explore more. And then before we finally come to the end of the lesson, I have something for you. That's explore yourself. So you'll have to explore yourself. So the first question I have for you is, explain why a big change in the price does not have any impact on painting like Mona Lisa. So what is Mona Lisa here is an antique. So you'll have to say why. Question number 2. Inelastic goods are often described as necessities, while elastic goods are considered as luxury items. Why? Why do you think so? These are the 2 questions that you'll have to further explore, research, and write it. So with this, I have come to the end of the lesson. Thank you so much for being with me, and have a nice time. Thank you.